We're glad to see you all here. We wish we could actually see your faces, but we're pretending. We can see your names. We're so happy to get to do this virtual event launch for Administrations of Lunacy. My name's E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We were founded in 1974 in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're now located directly across the street from Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. We have known Mab Segrest for a long time. We've been old friends, and we're here to celebrate this new book. But we also have to mention this book, which has just been re-released. Memoirs of a Race Traitor is a book that, if you've not read it, it's a canonical book. It's a really important book, and it's the experience of this book really, I think, has led to this book. And so it's just been re-released in the 25th anniversary edition by the New Press. This book is also published by the New Press, and so really we're celebrating the sort of spiritual connections between these two books tonight. I want to encourage you to purchase one or both of these books from charisbooksandmore.com. Currently, during the coronavirus crisis, Charis is shipping daily to anywhere in the United States for as little as $3 a day. Please support independent presses and independent bookstores. We really need your help. It's really important in this moment as authors are launching books in a moment when the news is so saturated with the crisis that we do what we can to support these really essential books. And I can think of no more relevant and essential book than Administrations of Lunacy. So as we're tuning into the news every night and seeing the racial disparities with how COVID-19 is shaping our world right now, with who is forced to go to work, who doesn't have the option to sequester themselves or be quarantined, who is dying, and who is suffering in terms of, incarceration and everything else. All of that history is in this book. And we're really fortunate to have a sort of roadmap for how we got to where we are today. So I hope that for folks who have just joined us, as you're tuning in right now, you'll see there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom. Please just write your question in there. We're going to do our best to get to as many as possible. This is a book that is meant to accompany you through some really dense history, but not be scary. We want you to be able to really hear the voices of the people who lived through some pretty horrific history, and also sort of take heart for the history that we're living through today. So I'm really honored to welcome a friend and a hero, Mab Segrest. Mab's going to take us through this history tonight. I'm going to get out of the way. Please enjoy yourself. Ask a question through the poll, and we'll be bringing some folks up later to ask some more questions. But for now, sit back, enjoy some stories, and welcome to Administrations of Lunacy.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm delighted to have us here together. Even though I can't see you, you can see me. So that's half of it, I guess. Maybe not quite half, but I'm delighted here to be with Charis too, which is my favorite bookstore. And over decades and decades, I've come in and out of Charis with new work. I've presented on this book on the many years, 15. It's been in the works. A lot of people kind of weren't sure that I was going to actually finish it. And I was kind of shocked when I did, but it's here and I'm quite delighted. Not only have it in my hands, but that you can get it into yours. In fact, it's going out now through the mails, which is all we have to stay in, except for, of course, for Zoom and Comcast and all of these digital platforms, which are good for quarantine. So we're meeting too, obviously, in the time of COVID and an epidemic and a pandemic that's really unlike anything we've lived through. And yet people have lived through things they hadn't lived through before too. So we're really feeling our way through this in an extraordinary time. And I'm really happy to be able to use this Charis platform to have a Georgia launch. I would have been at the Atlanta History Center this evening if COVID hadn't intervened. I would have been in Milledgeville last week because I felt some accountability to bring this story for the people of Georgia back to the people of Georgia. And so Charis lets me do that in this virtual way. If you're looking, if you don't, anyway, the image that you see here or not is of a white woman, 71 years old, pretty gray hair, but it's kind of shiny because it got the light shining on it. Got a black shirt on and a little colorful scarf, and I'm sitting in the corner with green in the back of my office in a house in Durham on the Eno River, which is a spectacular place to be if you have to be quarantined, I must say. So y'all have to come to see us when the quarantine is. I've imagined you as readers for years. I mean, I started 15 years ago imagining this book, getting first the idea of it. And then it took a long time. I wrote some essays. I did lots of archival research, probably 10 years of it. I've never done that before. And then I got a contract with the New Press, which has been spectacular to work with, and had to do a very detailed kind of prospectus. And so about 4 years ago, actually, I started writing it. And it took longer. It's supposed to take 2, it took 3, and then it took 4. It took me a long time. And I wasn't sure actually that I was going to finish it. At points I thought, well, maybe this is just my hobby or something, but I actually did in 17 chapters. So it's the longest and most ambitious thing that I've ever tried to do. And I'm very glad it's finished. And I'm actually very proud of it too, because I worked harder on it than I have any other writing project or intellectual project in my life. And I got drawn into the archives. I'll give you a little bit of like introduction, and then I'll give you a little bit of overview of the themes of the book, and then I want to read to you from it to show you, to kind of talk you through how I put it together, particular passages that meant a lot to me and that I hope will to you, and give you a sense of how I was thinking about you, the reader, all the time I was writing. I mean, writing is such a solitary thing, and writing on a computer is just this like silver screen and these little chicken scratchings, but you're really projecting oneself. Writers project ourselves, all of those people that we want to pick up a book someday and read it, and not just put it aside or let it fall under the bed or something, to really read the book. I want you to read this book all the way through. And I've taken a lot of extra time to try to make it tight and interesting and safe, because this is a hard topic. If you put together white supremacy and racism in the United States with psychiatry and mental institutions, that's very intense. And I was aware that it was for me to write it. And so I had to find ways to keep myself sane and healthy and hopeful as I was unfurling this story. So I want to just explain some of that to you too, to let you see how you might experience the book as you read it, because I do want you to get it or borrow it, and I want you to read it, and I want you to be in touch with me about it. Because for Memoir of a Race Trader, some of my best friends I've made through that book. They happen to be excellent people who like that book. They really are. So I'm hoping to make friends through this book too, and you can get in touch with me through an instant messenger through my Facebook. So if you read it and you want to be in touch and have some dialogue, then be in touch with me, because I would love to do that. And you spend so much time in solitude in a book like this. And it's really a joy. I think people maybe don't realize, and not all writers feel this way, but for me, it's a joy to start hearing back from people, even if there's critiques or, get mad about something, but you really love something or something. The reviews have been wonderful that way. The interviews have been good that way. And I'm hoping to have some of that with you too, and starting tonight. I've got a little list over here. If you want more information, or if you want a kind of warm up to a long book you're not so sure about, go to mabsegrest.com, which is my new Facebook page. And it's got a section in the back of reviews and news. And it has various things that I've done, interviews. There's a wonderful interview that Laura Flanders did with me all across Alabama and into Georgia last year, including lots of shots of Central State Hospital, which is the asylum that is the center of this book. And it's called Lunacy and Lynching. And they did a wonderful job. So if you want to look at that, if you want to look at interviews or something, but ultimately I hope you get to the book. So what's this about and how did I get into it? I'm not a psychiatrist, not a medical historian, not even an historian. I do have a PhD in English literature, so it gives me a sense of text and language and loving to tell a story. But I think more than anything for this, I'm a storyteller. And when I hit this information, I realized this was a hell of a story. And I got into it really kind of sideways and backwards from 3 ways. Number one, when I was little, maybe 4 ways. When I was like an adolescent in Alabama, there was this threat: you better be careful, or they'll send you to Bryce's. You know, if you were being too interesting or curious, or a little gender bending or whatever, you didn't know where Bryce's was. It happened to be the state mental hospital. And that happened across the country. You just fill in the blank for Jackson or Bryce's or wherever the hospital was. And you knew, you didn't know what happened there, but you knew you needed to straighten up. I really loved also Georgia writers, Alabama too, but Georgia's got a lot of great writers. Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, who was condemned to Milledgeville when she got lupus, had to go back and stay with her mother and write in Andalusia. Alice Walker's in the next county, really wonderful writers. And Carson McCullers, member of The Wedding, had Frankie Adams in it, this little gender bending kid that was, you know, really operating an hour from where I was 20 years later, this little gender bending kid in Tuskegee. And her maid, Bernice, really threatened her. You know, you better be careful, because those blue cops going to come around here and tie you up and drag you off to Milledgeville. And it sounded so familiar that I really wanted to figure out what Milledgeville had been for Carson. So there's that. Second thing was, I found out from my Aunt May in my 30s, this deep, dark Segrest family secret, which was that my great-grandfather, Charles Segrest, in 1903 had been committed to Bryce's, this very hospital I had been threatened with. And he did because he thought he had been thinking he saw people shooting at him from trees. And then he started shooting back. And his family felt like this was too dangerous. They didn't see anybody. They felt like he was really hallucinating it, which I assumed that's it. Well,
you sound great.
To be back, yes. And all of this COVID stuff is very improvisational. And so we just had a little glitch and now we're back. So just telling you, though, about the whole thing, like how does a culture that promotes lynching decide who's sane? How do you do it at that level? What happens then for me, for like Southern insanity, growing up as a white person, young white person in the South, Southern insanity seems like a redundancy. Like, I mean, it's so much weird and crazy stuff in the culture because of the way racism shapes it. So how do we really sort our way through that? And Administrations of Lunacy is my attempt to do that. And I want to read to you some from it and talk you through a little bit what I was trying to do. When I originally started this project, I thought I would do it in the 1940s with Carson McCullers and this kind of epigee of this asylum that was by then 10 to 12,000 people. It was the largest in the world. It had the largest graveyard of disabled people in the world. It had the largest kitchen in the world. It was really iconic in all the worst ways about Southern psychiatry and about American psychiatry writ large. So what would you understand if you saw those questions of sanity or not, which have to do with our emotions? How are they normal or not? How much they register our ideas? Are they hallucinations or are they something called real? I mean, how do you like negotiate all of those things when you have the state psychiatric institution mediating them for you in such really a terrifying way by the middle of the century? So how really do you tell that story? And I kept getting drawn back and back and back. And I was very curious about what it meant for an asylum to be founded in a slave culture. It was founded in 1842, height of abolition, really starting to heat up. And so what did it mean to be founded in Georgia in 1842? So I really wanted to go back and write the whole arc of it. But that's 170 years. It was a very ambitious project when I took on the contract with the New Press. But then when I get back to 1842, it's like, does the story really start there? Because what happened in the 1830s in Georgia? Well, it was a Trail of Tears, you know, and it was 5 years after the last of the missions of the Trail of Tears, the forced marches of Cherokees to Oklahoma by the military, that the asylum was started. So, and then what about the land it was on? It was Muskogee land, which we called Creek when I was growing up, the Creeks and the Cherokees, but really it was Muskogee. They just lived on creeks, and all the settlers said all those Indians who live on creeks are called Creeks, which they were very different than that. So I wanted to understand that too. Like, how do you put together a narrative where so much has been omitted to work it back in? You know, how do you work against the grain of this narrative? So I ended up really going pretty far back and then coming up to 1842. But I want to read to you some while we're still connection from the very first of the patients. And the other thing I wanted to do with this book was tell it from the patient's point of view, which is very rare most medical stuff and psychiatric stuff, because it's hard to find them. But but I was determined to do that. And for the early part, I was really fortunate that I finally found the first annual report from the Georgia Asylum for Lunatics, Epileptics, and Idiots. Two of those three, lunatics and idiots, are very terms really of opprobrium and really ugly terms today that had different meanings back then. And I'll really be using sometimes the language of the day because it's called that, and sometimes I will use the more appropriate and contemporary one in terms of mental illness or in terms of cognitive disability or so forth. So most historians will do this when they're writing about an era. They use the language of the times, which I do as much as I can across these. And the other thing to understand too is like that I have never been committed to a psychiatric institution, and I've never been diagnosed officially with any DSM or diagnostic and statistical manual category, so I don't write from that lived experience, but a lot of people do and have done huge amounts of organizing and liberation work on these questions of psychiatry, and I really respect those. I have, by the time when I was born in Alabama, I was diagnosable under DSM-2 until 1972, and I was a criminal in North Carolina until 2002 under the sodomy laws. And I was a sinner in all the Christian denominations except for one or two. So I've really been an outsider, and I could have been there. I always recognize that could have been me. So I write more from that could have been me perspective than from that it was me. And I'm always very interested to hear from people whose perspective that was. I also wanted to focus on these patients because part of the method of this book, we know about trauma, that one of the things that helps people be resilient is to have just one person accompany them. And so I wanted to have a kind of methodology of accompanying these patients, like walking with them, seeing things from their perspective, and starting as many chapters as I could with a particular patient. So you had to see all the other stuff from that patient's point of view. And I was hopefully, and kind of weird maybe to think, but retroactively, maybe this was helpful to these people because I really felt their presence, and they've gotten to be some of my best friends, which can maybe be pretty peculiar at certain points in this process. So I want to start then with Samuel Henderson, who comes out of the 1845 annual report by this peculiar first superintendent, David Cooper, who wanted to eternize himself and be a great writer and write a stupendous annual report. And he did such an over-the-top job that he was fired the next year, and it was really trashed by the American Journal of Sanity. And the other thing he did, though, is put verbatim 33 first case histories into this report. So there's a huge amount of information on these early patients' psychic history. And my thesis was anything as profound and formative as slavery and genocide and removal of indigenous people is going to shape everybody in the culture. The first 25 years, it's white people, and then African Americans come in 1867, and indigenous people are absent from the records because they've been gone for 5 years and just erased from history. So how do you go back and find that? So I start with Samuel Henderson, and then I kind of open the perspective to say, now, just a minute, what was happening to indigenous people? What happened to slavery? How do we move forward? But this is Samuel Henderson. I'll read a little bit. Samuel Henderson had been in chains a long time for a white man. That March of 1844, as he stood upright in the groaning wagon and strained against the iron around his wrists, he must have heard the voice of God somewhere along the road from Cobb County to Milledgeville. If thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. Perhaps God spoke to Samuel not so far from where the driver sought shelter in a sudden storm. In the slash of thunder, searing light turned to crack, then boom as it hit a massive oak, where it crashed, then corkscrewed down a nearby pine, first stripping bark, then blowing it 2 feet out, the surge following the trunk to root and then to ground. Perhaps Samuel then began to pull and rattle in his chains until he felt the fury that started like the lightning but running up his body till all he heard was his own roaring sound. By his journey's end, Samuel had plucked out the offending organ. He arrives at the asylum with his eyeball hanging from its socket. Paroxysm, the superintendent would note, one of two Samuel suffered getting to the doctor's door. The Georgia Asylum had opened 18 months before his arrival, financed with money that white settlers paid at bargain prices for native land. The road Samuel traveled that March, driven in the wagon by two white men from his home, covered the 150 miles or more from Milledgeville. Over the next 17 decades, thousands of patients like Samuel Henderson would make the journey to Milledgeville and cross the center building's portal in steps that would become the most portentous of their lives. Perhaps when his mind had cleared from sleep or exhaustion, Samuel wondered what he had done to deserve his condition. And then I take the material from the annual report, and you hear his brothers have written this letter. They've sent it with him. He's got 8 brothers to Dr. Cooper to explain that 10 years ago, he had been this upstanding citizen and deacon in the Presbyterian church and was doing everything like he should in his family. And all of a sudden, he got this excessive devotion to God. And he was increasingly alienating them and increasingly going off in a different direction. And they tried to bring him in. They felt like he was too facetious in his prayers that savored of irony, which is very dangerous in the South, for white people at that time to be ironic. And so they were restraining him. He got more mad. And so what they did is they took chains and they nailed him. They put him in chains and they nailed him to the floor. And they kept him there for 9 years. 9 years. So he was pretty furious by then. You know, he was mad, and mad can be lots of things, including angry, because you're having these conflicts. So his brothers put chains on his legs and iron handcuffs around his wrists, by which Samuel was constrained for nearly 9 years to one spot most of the time. No doubt he lost track of the time. In the asylum, Cooper would note Samuel's stupor. Probably his fury at their power over him also grew during these years. When the new Georgia Asylum opened in 1842, the 5th in the South, the 14th in the country, the Hendersons decided to send Samuel. The 7 white men convened by the Cobb County Ordinary, a probate judge, to determine if Samuel was dangerous to the community, decided he was. So they transferred the chains that had fixed him in a cellar or wooden hut or house out back to the floor of the cart for his trip to the Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. Now, it was important to me in writing this. First, I was just going to show Samuel when Dr. Cooper opens the door and he sees this person who has an eyeball hanging out, which is a really grotesque kind of image. And then at one point, I just felt like, no, I want to know how he got there. I want to know why he did it. So this paragraph right here takes him back and then forward in my imagination. And I think I'm pretty close to it. Perhaps the move to the cart came as a relief. So much open sky and air, trees to watch, so many birds whose names he knew perhaps and spotted along the roads and the ponds and rivers along the way. The lapwings and plovers, jays and larks, chickadees, thrush, wood warblers and roseate spoonbills, coots and rails, even just their names were lovely, as he also marked their sharp or lilting sounds, a place to rest his mind. Perhaps these soothed him, even though the roads were dreadful, muddy in the rains, ruts so vast they had to lean left or right to keep the wagon from falling in. Perhaps spending more than a week sleeping under the March sky also calmed Samuel, gave him clear nights with leaves not yet on the trees, so that stars wheeled around in the branches, pinned to the heavens by the pole star. He could lie calm in those moments, and sleep came as an answer to prayers. Other times, though, he must have had a head of chatter. If thy eye offend thee, if thy eye offend. He had offended his family, and they had plucked him out. Maybe then the energy, the lightning took him, furious and ferocious. Maybe in that last paroxysm, he obeyed the voice he heard as God, so different from the coots' calls and the chickadees. And this was a very important passage for me to write because I wanted a place to rest my mind. And I thought you might also need places in this book to rest your mind. And these people had places also to rest their mind. It wasn't just universally terrible. People had agency, they had consciousness, they had ability to kind of navigate these spaces. So I like that paragraph a lot. And then as I'm shifting back from Samuel to say, okay, now here's just the narrow view of the Georgia Asylum, which most of these asylum books are told is a kind of cookie cutter, frankly. I mean, some of them are really good, but it's just psychiatric history plus the state's history, and what happened and the annual reports. And I wanted to locate this history in the turbulence of Georgia history, Southern history, and United States history, because this is a wild country. You might have noticed that. We're not told that it is. We're told it's the best in the world, we're the greatest in the world, smartest in the world. we're a wild country, and we're experiencing that right now. And so I thought that it was important to locate the history of a lunatic asylum in the fullness of history. And what I found when I was doing that was how consistently the role of these psychiatric asylums run by the state was to take the history out of patient symptoms, right? So you just turned up with some weird behavior, not some history of trauma that was happening because we're in the middle of settler colonialism. It's a very violent kind of thing, and that constitutes our consciousness. So I wanted to really pull that back. I wanted to look at Cherokee removal and what was happening there and how it happened, then look at these slave coffles, African Americans being brought down in the 1830s also from the Carolinas because plantations are opening up across the South because the cotton gin makes cotton, going to make it the most profitable crop in the whole world. I mean, those plantations worked by African Americans as slaves drove the global economy. They really did. People will work to death on them. And so I wanted to understand that. And you better believe if somebody, white person, 25 years there, lands in this asylum, that's going to have influence them. So I was looking for the places where I could talk about that. And I'm jumping a little bit since we lost a little bit of time. But the other thing that I found to help show, like, how do you put history in when it's been extracted? And I found, I went to the American Journal of Insanity, one very intense several weeks in the library, kind of flipping through it to see how they dealt with slavery, and they completely didn't. I mean, there's no mention in the 1850s, 1840s, when it was building to this massive climax for a civil war. The psychiatric journals didn't mention it at all, but they did have this one article. I found it was fascinating. It's like this big, called Exemption of Cherokee Indians and Africans from Insanity. And it provided three perspectives on settler colonialism and psychiatry. Two of them were from Georgia. And there was a kind of peculiar, well, it's all peculiar, but this particular form of peculiarity for psychiatric attitudes and people's attitudes about insanity in the United States in antebellum period was that people in the United States were really more insane than anywhere else in the world. And then this would be white people, right? I mean, white people. But this insanity was a kind of tribute to intellectual superiority because white people's minds were so much more developed than primitive people's who didn't feel or really think that much, you know? So somehow it got to be a tribute to white supremacy, that white supremacy is driving white people crazy, you know? So this seemed to be a very peculiar idea to me, and I wanted to try to turn it on its head because my thesis is this much violence makes people act in aberrant ways. It puts them into altered states, or people assume they are and they send them to the asylum in the first place, you know? And so this little piece had three informants to talk about this. And the Journal of Insanity would get all these people and testify. They're like, yeah, no. Like Chinese people don't do like this, or so-and-so. And so here's three of them. Testimony from all three informants purported to demonstrate the superiority of white people's tendencies toward going insane in comparison to mental primitive types. First, the article conveyed Dr. Charles Lillibridge, government medical officer, who superintended the removal of the Cherokee Indians and who saw more than 20,000 Indians and inquired much about their diseases on their forced journey west. It concluded he never saw or heard a case of insanity among them on the Trail of Tears. Second, Dr. Eliza Butler, for 20 years a devoted missionary and physician among the Cherokees, reported an intelligent chief who had toured the asylums in Philadelphia, a man now 80 years old, told him he had never known a case of insanity among his people, such as he had seen there. Yeah, and like, you know, this is how to tell a story that I had put together for 15 years, getting fragmented by this, you know, anyway, something's flickering up in here. So where I was, though, is using this one little article from the American Journal of Insanity about these two at least major historical figures are just reduced to these people who were brought to an asylum to testify that indigenous people, Cherokees, or African people in America are not insane like white people are, to testify to white intelligence, if you can get your mind around that. So who's Samuel Butler? I tracked him down. He was a missionary. He was a major figure. He moved down to Uachota in 1827. He fell in with very radical preachers down there, white men who were allied, and their families who were allied with the Cherokees and were on their side as they were really in the last stages of trying to avoid white encroachment. And the Cherokees had been the people who were the most, who had been the most strategic. They were some of the last folks, the last indigenous tribes to move out of the Southeast. And they had been most strategic about assimilation, kind of strategic assimilation, to try to not to be as displaced and attempt to destroy as so many other tribes had been. So they had an alphabet. They had a newspaper in Cherokee. They learned English. They wore dresses or pants. They farmed. They did all these things. But the one thing they did not do is privatize their land. And that was the one thing the state of Georgia really wanted to do, all this other stuff, so they would get into debt and they would learn about materialism and possessions so they could get the land. Cherokees wouldn't do that. So by that time then, the officials in Milledgeville, which is a state capital, were like, okay, we're going to get them out. And Andrew Jackson was the president. He'd been an Indian killer and general, and he was right on that program. So the Cherokees sued the federal government with Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester was one of those other radical preachers and a very good friend of Eliza Butler. And then the Cherokees, the state of Georgia passed the law. Legislature in Milledgeville said, no white people can live on Cherokee land. And these guys just said, we're staying, and they got arrested. And there's this really gripping account of Butler being taken from Uachota to Milledgeville, about 150 miles, behind a horse at night with a rope around his neck. And he stumbles, the horse falls on him, he has to get up. It's this dreadful march that these soldiers are doing to this white man who has allegiance to the native people. And when he comes into Milledgeville, there's pipes and drums to meet him, and he is drummed into prison. And this is where they say, this is where the enemies of Georgia stay, in hell or in prison. So this is Eliza Butler. He's a hell of a guy. And he's so reduced, such a little thing in the American Journal of Insanity, when you can tell a lot of Indian removal just by kind of pulling him out of that. He's a doctor too, and so he goes on the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees. And so then when this old intelligent chief, who may be John Ross, comes back and is shown the folks who are committed to this asylum by Kirkbridge, who's one of the main superintendents, in order to testify that no, Cherokee people don't do that. I just kind of imagined them on the way back on the train together. There's Eliza Butler and John Ross, very old friends, have been through a lot together, and they're really laughing about it. Like, they must have really rolled their eyes. Oh no, no, you white people are much more insane than we are. It was, and if there was anybody in the United States, any white man, I think, who knew that the Cherokees were not primitive, who had seen the level of culture they had achieved, who had worked with them at it, who had brilliantly strategized to get a case to the Supreme Court that's still native sovereignty case positive by John Marshall, Worcester versus Georgia. It was Eliza Butler. So just by rescuing him from the American Journal of Insanity, then I got to tell a lot of that story. There's another person I really love a lot who's a patient, whose name is Nancy Malone. And I'm going to end up kind of telling you more than reading you, hoping you'll read the book. But Nancy Malone was another one of these people that was going a little too fast because I feel like I've lost. Oh my gosh, I'll slow down. Okay, so Nancy Malone, one of my favorite people in this book. But she was one of those people that Superintendent Cooper told too much about. But she ends up there in 1844. And they say she's an idiot. But actually, I am going to find out how they describe her, because she just talks backwards, forwards, and sideways. Nancy was loquacious, querulous, ranting, and profane, frequently imagining wars, battles, murders, camp meetings, Indian invasions, and massacres, going on in rapid progression and retrogression in her confused farrago of delusive mental perceptions and aberrations, with her appalling apprehensions of defeat or exhilarating anticipation of success, by the belligerent combatants. Then Nancy assaulted, though innocent, I'm still quoting, holding religion and scripture in derision and contempt, almost incessantly talking to herself and supposed persons. She was Crazy Nancy, channeling the energy of Georgia's settler history. And she was every bit a sight on arrival as Samuel had been. She was a beggar and a wanderer. She was unkempt, her clothes and person disheveled, but most notable was her hair, so long and glued and matted, he wrote, that together they couldn't be combed. The matron and her servants then had to work it out. We will assume it was these enslaved women who were doing it. The snip of scissors must have started the back of her head. Matted hair began to cover the ground or fill a bucket. Closer to the skull, the attendants discovered not only, quoting, the ordinary vermin of more than ordinary size and unusual corpulence ensconced in countless numbers, but also the hairy worm or slipper found in old bacon. They dropped in the thing and she was taken away, and she was allowed to go out, and she really had a much better life there. He didn't find it necessary to confine her, but I was very fascinated that she had these constant kind of conversations, really manic probably conversations about wars, Indian massacres, all of these things that were happening in the culture. And we don't particularly know what she said, but we know what was happening. So I kind of imagine that Nancy, who is this wanderer who went all the way from East Georgia to West Georgia in Cherokee County, she had walked a bunch of ways. And I can imagine her getting back in the woods or these huge camp meetings where there were 10,000 people. And I imagine that them preaching so ferociously that they imagined that the devil was tossing them all into a lake of fire. Now, how you decide when you got 10,000 people imagining that, who goes to the Georgia Asylum is a question I always wondered, but they wasn't operating like that, So I can just imagine that Nancy's up under the bushes. She's watching some of the paterolers, like the white men who are out looking for escaped folks, and back further in the woods, there are these trails where enslaved people are really meeting in the bushes or have escaped and run back to the swamp or something, and that she's been mixed in this, and that she's really on both sides in a way. She's not taking sides, or she's really, anyway, I imagine that she's made these journeys, and she's made these journeys with these people, and it allows me to bring more in. Like, here's the Cherokees going west, and here's couples of enslaved people coming south, and maybe Nancy Malone is up in there watching them. So she was another of these people that I traveled with in order to tell the story and find a way to tell the story. So I'm happy to take a few questions too, and then I want to go on to Reconstruction for a little while.
Yeah, so I think in the interest of not tempting fate, I'm gonna read some questions to you rather than bringing up some other folks. So the first one that got 13 votes is from T. Hamidi, and they said, I'm a family member / caregiver for someone who's been in and out of the jail system, county hospitals, the streets, et cetera, and looking forward to this talk. I'm very curious how you will suggest we hold judges accountable for how they sentence those with chronic mental health challenges. They hold so much powers, as do the doctors. Both hold too much authority and create harm for this vulnerable population. Thank you.
Right. Absolutely, yes. And this lets us come to the present. I went back to the past, but felt completely responsible to land us in the present. And the statistic that lands me and us in this book more than any other is that today 90% of state psychiatric beds are in jails and prisons. 90% of beds in jails and prisons. Even the Sheriff's Association in 2014 said this was incomprehensible. Well, if you study history of racism, it's not incomprehensible. And this is a book that traces step by step by step what that process was. And basically, when people got released from state mental hospitals because they were awful, they didn't know how to do it, they weren't paying enough to do it, and there were drugs that were supposedly miracle, they weren't. And the federal government promised that when folks came out of state hospitals where they'd been treated abominably, they would go into community care, and there would be money committed to that at the state and the local level. Well, people came out, but the money wasn't there because these austerity programs, starting with Ronald Reagan, but Nixon really before that, started taking all the money out of social welfare and human services and putting it into military and police. There was this huge shift. Some people call it, that kind of peculiar word, neoliberalism, but it was leaching out the infrastructure for human welfare and giving it to the police. And so as you had people coming out and there was no money for community care, you also had huge amounts of growing mass incarceration. So that in 1980, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. And by 2010, the figure is 2 million, 2.3 million. It's down some there. So mass incarceration absorbed all of those beds. And then the main services for mentally ill people, they're supposedly in the jails and prisons, even though the sheriffs in this lament, this is terrible policy, knew they weren't prepared for it. It was just wretched all along. So it's part of the human rights abuse of mass incarceration. It's part of the new Jim Crow. It's part of this afterlife of slavery that keeps reinventing itself. And now we see it in the age of COVID that is taking everything to another level, and a eugenic level. One of the things I do in this book is trace the history of eugenics from these ideas about slavery in the 20th century. There's some people who are fitter than others, so you can sterilize them, or when the Nazis get a hold of it, they exterminate people, So some people it's just the way they are, it's biological, and so they need to be fixed or eliminated, or their progeny eliminated. So those ideas are really being stirred up again since 2016. The most execrable ideas can be recirculated as if they make sense, as if they're humane, as if they're good policy, as if they have anything but the worst history of this country behind them. And so now we have people trapped in these jails and prisons, too many people who never should have been there. Some people in jails where they're just there waiting because they couldn't pay the bail. And there's been a huge effort to end money bail to get people out of jail. And there's people all over the country, all over the South, really strong in Georgia, demonstrating this weekend to get people out of jail and let more and more people come out of prison and out of jail. But it's a terrible situation. And what I argue at the end of the book is, psychiatrists should be accountable to this too. And it's just one little part of the argument, but, we need to, there's an abolition movement. We abolish slavery, we abolish these institutions, we need to abolish prisons, it's not going to be less than that. How that happens, I don't know. But as we watch COVID unfold, we're seeing the beginning of that, and it's dreadful. And we need to be sure that it goes on the record and doesn't get erased, because a lot of this history got erased and erased and erased. So if you want to ask me a follow-up question to that or whatever, I just think we need to get people out of jail, and we need to pay for the social services and the community care and support to families that they deserve. And we have not done that systematically for 40 years. And that's what you're suffering. And that's what families all across this country are suffering. And we're seeing that suffering writ so large now with this virus that's being so maladministered. I mean, talk about administration of lunacy. We really have it now, and I love that title because it was Superintendent Powell, who's like the most racist, explicitly racist administrator around the turn of the 20th century. And he calls himself a lunacy administrator. So it's what professionally he was saying he was doing. But most of the time, too, the way I describe this anyway, the administrators was much problem. And the way they were operating made as little sense as they were saying that the patients did.
I think this person is curious specifically about, is there any way to hold judges more accountable?
Right. Well, people doing court watching, they're electing different judges. They're putting those pressures there. They're putting pressures on sheriffs to let people out. But I mean, sitting in courts to see what's happening and then to call those judges accountable is one way to do it. So I'm not so sure of the specifics of this situation, but there's a huge amount of different tactics across the South. Southerners on the Ground does that. Other organizations do too. And if you're not connected to those, you should get connected to them and ask for help and assistance and able to be able to negotiate that court system. I mean, if you've got, 20 people who've come to court to watch this judge and how she or he performs towards people when they're in court, then the judge often changes their behavior. And if they don't, you can vote them out the next time and vote different people in. I know in Durham, we voted some different judges who are much more humane, and they abolished 72,000 traffic tickets so people can get a driver's license and get to work and all this kind of stuff. So there's a sea change going on there, but a lot of people don't get the benefit of it. So maybe another question.
Yeah. So you may know this person. Your daughter Annie asks, Mom, when you first started the research for this book, I was in social work school. Over a decade later, Administrations of Lunacy is born, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. In our respective ways, we spent parallel years pushing back against the DSM, and yet the book still looms large in the world of mental health, as does the practice of pathologizing those who exist outside the bounds of so-called normalcy. How would you like to see Administrations of Lunacy inform mental health work moving forward?
Well, thank you very much, Annie, for that question, and also for your support over all these years of this book, too. And I'm very proud of you. And I'm glad we're doing this parallel work. But one of the things I track, in addition to like in mass incarceration, is the diagnostic system. And DSM, the fifth DSM, was broadly challenged across psychiatry and healing professions because it was so regressive. It had it had overdiagnosis, creating false epidemics for vulnerable populations. It had a strictly biomedical model, no sociocultural variation, they called it, no context, no history, no trauma. And it really caught a lot of people, and it was quite regressive. And in fact, there was a whole set of humanistic psychologists who called to rethink psychiatry from the ground up, to rethink suffering from the ground up, because this set of practices that I traced the origin of around 1910 in Georgia, which was always, well, it did a lot of things. I don't oversimplify this, but by 2013 for DSM-5, I had begun to track it and the dangers of it and the origins of it. And then by DSM-5 in 2013, it's repudiated by the National Institute for Mental Health for being unscientific. So you have all these diagnoses, and then you have this new science of the brain, and they don't match up. And so the profession was really in a crisis about that. Now, in terms of how this book could help, there are already professional people out there wanting to rethink human suffering in this country from the ground up. Not to put aside these other conceptions that have just accumulated kind of bad information, and we have new science that doesn't back them up. So if we want to rethink things from the ground up, then here's some ground to think about them from. This 2,000 acres, 2 miles outside of Milledgeville, Georgia, on 170 years, that looks at settler colonialism and racism and the profound impact that it had, the haunting that it had on American psychiatry. So that today we look at afterlives of slavery, like 90% of beds in psychiatric beds in jails and prisons, or the diagnostic categories being repudiated by the main federal research arm, saying it's unscientific. And so there's a lot of scrambling there. But when I have talked to therapists before this and social workers who are the humanistic part and the justice part and the sociocultural variation part and the understand and help and uplift people and empower them from their own strengths too, the best social workers, which you are, then they've been working around the DSM, and they have told me that what they would do is take the diagnosis that had the least stigma, but would allow the most access to services or insurance. Because in this age of big pharma and mass incarceration, there's a triangulation between insurance companies, DSM and American Psychiatric Association, and doctors. But the doctors have to negotiate these things. And you have to have a diagnosis to get insurance, to get medicines, which there's questions about those too. So how to negotiate the DSM or operate outside of it. And I do think that therapists, other kinds of healers, like the psychiatrists now, are mostly being sure if somebody needs drugs or wants them, or they feel like they need them, like to manage the medication. But social workers and other forms of therapists are doing the talk therapy that was really kind of the core of the best of what was called the moral therapy in the asylum. You listen to people, you feed them well, you give them a structure, you take them away from their family some and let them kind of build themselves back up. And it would have worked, except they overcrowded and they had a very bad idea about medicine that you purged and bled people, and that really sapped people too. So anyway, I hope to give a broader conversation. I hope to encourage the most progressive parts and to engage these conversations, and really to focus on these questions of race and the legacies of race and what they do to us today.
So the next question comes from Leah. And Leah asks, of the many stories of people who were institutionalized at Milledgeville that you found among the records and the archives and the newspapers, which ones stand out the most for you?
Right. The one that stands out the most to me is the one I end the book on. And I stopped the book there because I didn't think anything else really needed to be said. And her name, well, the name I call her is Mary Roberts. We use pseudonyms for privacy. But also just privacy for families and stuff like that. But she was committed in 1911. And the remarkable thing about the last, like what happened in 1910, 1911 in Georgia, is that part of the archival discoveries is you like going through boxes and ledgers and all this kind of stuff. And there's this 30 boxes of case histories of patients from 1909 to 1924. So I had them start bringing those out. And it was like, holy cow, that one. That quite, anyway, holy moly, whatever holy, because they were typed verbatim interviews of doctor-patient conversations, and they had the medical interviews typed, and they had the staff meeting where they decided typed. And so what you get for the first time in all of this, it was exhilarating to me, is actual patient voices, because these secretaries are sitting there with typewriters, thank God, so it wasn't microfiche. And you get these conversations between the doctors and the patients. And the one with Mary Roberts was the most, I'm going to try to find a part of it, I'm thinking about this, but was the most coherent story. And I think the most coherent person. And they committed her for dancing, shouting, crying, praying, which apparently disturbed folks back in the county. So they got there and they did the medical examination. And then the main thing the doctors had to discuss was she manic depressive or was she schizophrenic? But they asked her questions, things like, because they had these new diagnoses. So one of them was manic depression. So they asked her, are you happy? Are you sad? And then for the schizophrenia, like your sense of reality, do you see visions? You talk to God? Anything unusual ever happen to you? Well, folks in Georgia have been talking to God their whole lives. It's called prayer, and they go to church, and you're supposed to do that, So you have this immediate conflict between the culture and the diagnoses. And you have these bozo kind of doctors who don't know anything anyway, and they're mainly trying to put people in these boxes and paying attention to what really might have happened. So if you read medical records, Mary Roberts had 11 pregnancies. And she lost 9 of those children, 9 of those babies. So, it doesn't take a lot of sensitivity or imagination to see that this dance, the praying, the dancing, the shouting, the crying, these were kind of grief practices. And I compared it to the shout dance, which was which was in a lot of African American churches and was this kind of rhythmic dance, probably from Africa, kind of Sufi kind of movements where you could kind of get yourself into a trance. And I really imagine that Mary was doing that. And the doctors were totally irritated because she stayed exalted on the ward. She wouldn't work. And they kept saying, and she's exalted on the ward. And I thought, good for her. I mean, I wrote this essay about her. I called it Exalted on the Ward, because if you can be in such a constricted, if you've already had this much grief anyway, you know, there's an epidemic of infant deaths in African-American communities in the early 20th century, as there is now. But if you've already had that grief, and then you get put in such a constricted space, as many, you know, we've been experiencing some degree of constriction, but there's an extreme constriction there. But if you have a spiritual practice that allows you to stay exalted on the wards, then good for you. And when Mary had this exchange with her doctors, the doctor said, well, do you talk to people? You know, do you talk to folks? Do you talk to dead people? And she said, yes. She talks to her brothers and sisters. She got 4 or 5 dead brothers and sisters. And the doctor said, well, what do you say? And she said, well, they just, you know, shit. She said, I mean, I can see her thinking, like, I'm not going to tell you, you know, so just, I don't know. And he said, well, they're not real, are they? And first she said, no. And then he asked her again, just to make the point, you're not real, are they? And she said, just a minute, you can see it, just a minute. She said, they are not living, but they are real. And I thought that was the most profound 2 lines in the whole book. And it really, you know, and I had started off this book wanting to come with the patients, because they don't need theorists. They don't need Freud. They don't need Foucault. They don't need people to explain their experiences. They understand their experiences. And if we can textualize them and listen closely enough to the archives, we know what they are. So I just felt like she beat him in terms of metaphysics, what's real. You know, they're living. They're not living, but they're real. In terms of epistemology, how you know things, you can talk to ancestors. You know, it's not manic depression or schizophrenia or whatever, you know. So I just felt like she was this valiant example of somebody who had been, you know, and one of the things I say at the end of it, it's like these doctors never even asked her why she was crying or what she prayed for. And yet here she is doing this dance where in many of African myths and traditions, African-American and stuff, the people could fly. You know, you could just kind of take off and fly if you did this, at least in your spirit or whatever. And so I really imagined her kind of taking off at the end and getting free of this, getting free of these constricted spaces. So I really wanted to let Mary Roberts end the official part of the book, because I felt like finally patients were speaking for themselves. They were arguing back to the doctors. They were winning the debates, but they didn't get out, you know, but they had their own ways to manage, you know, to transcend, I guess, to transcend. Okay. Here we have 15 minutes. I could tell you a little bit more, and then we could have some more questions, because I'm really glad you're bringing this up to the present. But in terms of this theme of history and the extraction of history, what I saw from all this study, for instance, that the little article in the American Journal of Sanity that completely ignored. But when I got to the part about lynching, it was really the crux of that. And it also answered for me that question, like, how does a culture that encourages lynching decide who's sane? And it was really key to that. And the method for that, how do you find it? African Americans started coming into the Georgia Asylum in 1867 from Freedmen's Bureau hospitals. And when I first saw that in the ledgers, it was electrifying. I got chilled, you know, and I thought, because I knew they were going to come in about them. But here these people have gone through slavery. Slow down, that's right. Gone through slavery. They've gone through this war, been emancipated, and then they're losing that freedom with the Klan violence and everything. And here they are in the asylum. So I had made a list of all the first folks who came in of all the African Americans who came in about 6 or 7 years. And then I wanted to match it up with the list of lynchings. And most of the documentation around lynching starts in 1880. But a colleague at Georgia College, where I was teaching for a semester, had one full semester, Stephanie McClure, knew Woody Beck, who's done a lot of the research on lynchings. And so she gave me his address, and I wrote to him, Professor Beck, you know anything about 1867 to 1880? And it just so happened that he had a list of lynchings in Georgia from 1867 to 1880 that filled in that gap. And it was by county, chronologically with all of the newspaper articles that were about those lynchings, because they're very sensational. So when I matched these up, I found the most lynchings in a county was in Columbia County, which is around Augusta. And then it was matched up with one African-American named Sally Cunningham, who became the patient that opened that. And the only thing her record said was no history furnished. And I said, okay, so here's what version of history is this? You know, like, if you've had 8 lynchings, the most lynchings in 3 to 5 years of any county in Georgia, brutal lynchings, one after the other, and then you get to the lunatic asylum, that's trauma. And especially when white people came in, they had the trauma of the Civil War registered. Like, this person was doing okay in Savannah, in Columbia, until Sherman came through and burned down the town, and now she's in the asylum, you know. So those kind of historical traumas were being measured for white people. But here, there's no measure of that, nor is there across these ledgers. So I got to ask this question, like, so there's an eradication of history here, you know, there's a dropping out, there's just this eradication of history. And I found this beautiful passage by Simon Gafundi called The Interpsychic Tomb. Like, what do you do? Where do these places go when these major events drop out of history? And he said they go into the interpsychic tomb, they just get left there. You know, so here's this profound silence in the psychiatric records. As profound as, like, you know, like, if psychiatry can't register this, what can it register? You know, like, what happens here to these psychiatric institutions that are scrubbing people of their history, of settler colonial history, of this history of white supremacy and racism? And I felt like right there, I have my finger on the answer in the archives, in Sally Cunningham, her experiences, and what happened in Georgia. Because what happens then, after you drop history out of, you know, you just give some symptoms, but you don't give the history, or you say, well, she's just manic, or she's crying and dancing and making too much noise, you know, and you don't look at what's happening in the context. Then you can take these same vulnerable people, poor people, Black people, immigrant people, many women, and you can reconstitute them as degenerate populations, which happens by the turn of the 20th century. And this degeneracy is characteristic of this group of people. It is biological. And so you have to either sterilize them, which starts in asylums by the 1930s, once the eugenics folks in the United States get the laws in place, or when it comes to Nazi Germany, as I said, you exterminate them. And Hitler's first extermination program, 1939, was Actium T4, and it went into asylums and took folks out. So this whole idea of history then I came to see in terms of colonial processes, that colonialism is extractive. Europeans went all over the globe and they took what they wanted back to Europe for themselves. So you can, if you need labor, you extract Africans from various cultures and on the African continent, you bring them over and you extract the labor from them, you extract their freedom from them. If you need land, you extract native people and you take them to Oklahoma so you have the land. If you need silver, you extract it from a mountain and you stamp it into coins and you send it to Europe, and it's the capital of capitalism. So what psychiatry in the asylums extracts is history. It extracts history. And so what I've tried to do in this book is put the history back in as dense a way as possible from the point of view of the people who experienced it, who thought about it, and who operated within it. And it's that idea about history that carries over today, because we're in the afterlife of slavery. We've never broken racism in this country. We've never broken the back of this pattern. We just keep replicating it. The Confederacy is alive and well. If you're in North Carolina, you know that, you know, and you can go right up. And so when we see this epidemic, we see all of these things still in a struggle to the death between the best practices, the most humane practices, all these doctors and nurses and all of these drivers and all these grocery clerks, all these people who are risking their lives to make our lives keep on going in a pandemic, versus an administration of lunacy at the top that has no coherent program, and is doing a set of policies that is resulting in remarkable amounts of death in this country. So I do think, even though this happened 6 months after I finished the book, if you work on something for 15 years, you get the sense of what the trajectory is. And I recently done an op-ed that I'm hoping is going to come out pretty soon on racism versus public health, and you can't have both of them. And I think we see that when we see people giving us the best information about the epidemic, and then we get the kind of blather that we get from other sources. 10 minutes. Other questions?
Yeah, so you kind of got at that, where our next question was going, which just was, what lessons from studying Milledgeville inform your perspective on coronavirus? Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Well, one of the crux of that for me was this guy, Superintendent Powell, who is the administrator of Lunacy. And there was an epidemic of tuberculosis within the asylum and across the culture in the 1880s, 1890s, into the 20th century. And he was trying to figure out why. And he divided up Black people and white people. And he said, well, white people have all these different reasons, but they're really not being more crazy. And then with Black people, he said, the main thing that these Southern superintendents were putting forward was that this was happening because slavery had been such a hygienic institution for Black people. And then once they got emancipated, this was the result. Completely racist, in retrospect, ahistorical, brutal argument, right? But what he wasn't doing while he was doing that is studying up on the germ theory of disease, and the tubercle bacillus, which was discovered in 1882 by Edward Koch, and it was airborne. I mean, we know about airborne things today. And this asylum was profoundly overcrowded, especially in the Black buildings. And so half of the cases were being propagated within the asylum. You have an epidemic, you have a public health epidemic within your asylum, while your main guy is talking about degenerate populations and immoral people, when he and the legislature have not done the job they needed to do to make people safer and not be so crowded, and to do the things you do to keep an epidemic. Also, this epidemic of pellagra by the 1910s, which the public health folks proved in Milledgeville was about vitamin deficiency, that really the overcrowded patients in this hospital were being starved because they were being fed molasses, fatback, coffee, and corn mush for breakfast. And God knows what they had for lunch and dinner. And it was a vitamin deficiency, it was turned out, but it was the diet. And Joseph Goldberger showed that, and he showed that if you take a Black women's ward and a white women's ward and you feed them, Goldberger's a good guy, he was a Jewish immigrant from Austria who came through New York, so he had a different point of view. And he said then, who doesn't get pellagra? Well, let's see, the well-to-do don't get pellagra. So let's feed these two Black and white women's wards the diet of the well-to-do. So he gave them this remarkable diet that they must have been really shocked about, and had them fed very carefully, and they didn't get pellagra. And then he took some prisoners, white prisoners down in Mississippi, not such good methodology here, and took 12 of them and gave them the pellagra diet, the starvation diet that most of the people in Milledgeville got, and they got sick, and they got freaked out and they left, but they got, anyway. So he proved you can cause pellagra and you can cure pellagra by feeding people right, and you feed them the diet of the well-to-do. So if you take that, or you take what Atlanta folks, the Black community in Atlanta was doing in 1910, which was to have a public health campaign where you had the best information, you did sanitation, you had clinics for people, you gave people education on what to do about it, and that's the way you deal with pellagra. So today we have public health, or racism, and the people who do the racism don't know how to think. I mean, their brains are just absorbed by these very bad old set of ideas, and they don't know how to get clear of it. But there are these other people who have the best information and the safest information. And history shows, I mean, if I had to choose between Superintendent Powell and all his blather and sterilization, or this public health campaign, or feeding people decently who need it in order to make them healthy, it's very clear you do the second. So public health is one of the heroes in my book. And these public health folks today, the health the doctors and nurses, and also the people doing these essential jobs who are paid the least for them, who have the least insurance, have the least protection and the most exposure, and are dying the highest. So these are the heroes, and they need in this world that's coming through this virus. We are seeing majorly, big time, where the most valuable work is, where the care work is, where the people are who are most valuable to us, that we value the least, and so we really, I think, have a chance to reshape a lot of the way we feel and insist that we reshape our priorities, our financial priorities, and our leadership here.
There's sometimes a little bit of a circular argument that anti-racists can get into around whether or not white supremacy is a form of mental illness, whether, like, if being racist is a form of disease, for lack of a better word. And then there's pushback on that from mad pride activists or disability justice folks who say, that's not, those things should not be correlated, right? Or they shouldn't. We don't want to have white supremacist ideology in a 1-to-1 ratio with people who have various kinds of mental illness, right? And there's too often a flattening when, say, a Dylan Roof goes and shoots up Mother Emanuel. Like, there's a way in which, when we try and talk about white supremacy as an illness, as an original sin, as all these things, that then that ends up harming people who have other legitimate kinds of concerns or interactions with the mental health and industrial complex, right?
I don't think it's a helpful question, and I don't think it's a helpful discussion, because you're referencing these categories of mental illness that are so corrupt and have just fallen apart. So it's like, I think racism is delusional. I think it is a departure from reality, and it makes it dangerous. And people who act apart from reality get themselves and other people in trouble. So when you think you're the greatest and the whole country's falling apart, for instance, that's delusional. I mean, racism is a construct, and it is a vicious construct, and it is a departure from the reality of the people it pretends to describe. And one of the things I try to do in my book is really show the vibrancy, the brilliance, the compassion of those people. I mean, I really try to have a kind of anti-defamation point of view, where when I'm presenting a racist construct, I try to always contradict it, to show the obverse of it, and to show really the depth and brilliance of these communities. And they have also the kind of survival experiences in devastating times that the rest of us don't have, if we've been floating on privilege or whatever. So there's a huge amount of wisdom there, and I've tried to really bring it to the fore in this book as a kind of pedagogy for white people, and to really go blow by blow by blow by blow how vicious racism is, and how it played itself out historically in a way that, if you read the book, you can't turn away from. At least I hope you can.
So we got time for, one more sort of final take home point. So what, if there's anything that you hope people will take from this book, if they don't know anything else or they don't remember anything else, is there something you want to make sure people go home with tonight?
Well, at the end, I wanted to how do we distinguish all of this? And so I came up with two different barrels. There's the afterlife of slavery. That's the ongoing legacy in the present of slavery and indigenous removal and racism and all the ways we've constructed it. And then there's what I call ecologies of sanity. There's all the things that people can do to keep ourselves healthy and sane. And I think we're experiencing this now when we do distance 6 feet and wash your hands and don't touch your face and, let's flatten the curve and all those kind of things. We're trying to change the ecology so this germ can't travel that way. So I like that, because it doesn't split like nature nurture. The body is always in history. It's impacted by history. It has its own history too, from the inside out. And we can clean it up. Like we can clean up a polluted stream or river. I mean, we have that experience. So we can clean things up however they are. We can have practices, scientific practices, cultural practices, health practices, community-based practices that really restore justice, restore more equitable distributions, and so therefore are more sane. And sanity has to be understood in that much larger context. And we have an opportunity now to really make that work, because it's our lives. It's life and death, raised to a level that people cannot ignore at this point.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody who hung out.
I'm sorry we can't go out for a beer.
I know.
Another time. And
with everybody.
Whatever you do.
Y'all have been amazing. You've been so generous and patient in your responses to our technology. I feel very, very grateful to all of you. But I mostly feel grateful to Mab, who debuted this book with us. 15 years of work. I love that we got to celebrate it with you tonight, and I'm so excited that this book is in the world. And it's a weird time to launch a book, but this book is so necessary for this moment, and I think the conversation we just had shows that. So if you don't have your book yet and you want to get it from Charis, we would love for you to do that. There's a link at the bottom of the page where you should be able to buy it from us directly. Just click on that. We will ship it right out to you immediately. And if you want to buy Mab's other books, just go to charisbooksandmore.com. We're happy to send it for $3 and get it to you right away. But this is necessary reading for our times. And if you enjoyed this, please just be on the lookout. We're going to edit it down, get our technological problems out of the way, get it captioned, get it up on YouTube so more people can see it. And when we do that, we'd love for you to share it out in the world. So as always, we are deeply grateful. Please be well. Everybody, wherever you are, give it up for Mab Segrest.
Also, though, go to my Facebook, Mab Segrest, and message me. Do Messenger to me there and let me know what you think about it.
Yes, lots of feedback. Yeah. Let Mab know. Mab's also on Twitter at Mab Segrest, so go follow her there.
And then mabsegrest.com if you want to see like the real, go to Milledgeville with me and Laura and like wander around and hear some of the same things.
Yeah. So follow everybody everywhere. Please be safe and be well. Let's work on our ecologies of sanity and keep on
seeing you in person.
Yes. Thanks, y'all. Have a great night.